In Chapter 3 of Understanding Socialism, Richard Wolff talks about the struggles and transitions between economic systems, namely how feudalism turned into capitalism and how socialism is likely to follow similar paths. Wolff points out right away that although capitalism feels very normal and natural to us, like it's always been here, the reality is it's not. There have been many economic systems throughout human history, from tribal systems to the feudal system to slave capitalist systems to modern capitalist systems. And the changes between these systems have been caused by all sorts of things like climate change or new technologies, social conflicts, wars, migrations, or most important to this conversation, class struggles. So what can we learn about past transitions between economic systems that might apply to a future transition to a socialist system? Since a transition from capitalism, like every economic system that came before it, is inevitable. Early socialists recognized the importance of looking back on previous transitions between economic systems. The one they focused on was in the 15th century when feudalism began to shift into capitalism. And by shift, I mean serfs got really mad and started burning the system down. We see that as well in the 20th century when socialism kind of shadowed capitalism. Wherever colonization went, socialism crept in the shadows as a response. And the lesson that's most obvious from the past is, again, these are class struggles. There are colonizers, and then there are the colonized. Wolff says that the basic lesson about transitions is summed up by Marx when he said, "The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles," meaning everything up to this point in all of human society was dictated by class struggles. So before capitalism, we had feudalism, and capitalism, no doubt, was an improvement upon feudalism. So how did we transition from feudalism to capitalism? Well, it came down to the dynamics between lords, or the people who owned the manors and made the decisions, and serfs, who did all the labor for those manors. Conflicts between lords and serfs were over all sorts of things. Labor and rental obligations, soil exhaustion from terrible feudal farming techniques, wars between lords, all sorts of things. And the transition from feudalism to capitalism is largely a story of that serf and his anger. Serfs went from disputes about work, this farming technique is dumb, to actually questioning the work. Why are they forcing us to do this poor farming technique? To challenging the work. We're not going to use your dumb farming technique anymore. To eventually overthrowing the system that made them do the work in the first place. Early on, that meant leaving. Leave. See ya. Later, it meant busting out the guillotines for the lords. And this is where capitalism begins to take shape as an economic system. Early revolutionary serfs would leave their manors, they'd run away, and they would look for these small enclaves of capitalism that had started popping up in feudal society. Oftentimes, the feudal lords would get really mad and just wipe these little colonies out. And because of this obvious pushback from the feudal lords, capitalism ebbed and flowed and went through waves, and it had a lot of trial and error of starts and stops. And eventually feudalism just accepted that it would live alongside capitalism. And increasingly over time, anti-feudal serfs hated the feudal system more and more and eventually torched the whole thing, and that was the American and French revolutions essentially. Now, the feudal system sucked as a system, and it had contradictions that led to two really noteworthy results according to Professor Wolff. The first is that competing manors eventually became hierarchical, meaning that they consolidated their power to one super manor, and then there was a hierarchy of manors going down that served the manor on top. The lords of the manors at the very top became kings. The second noteworthy result and contradiction was that the feudal system essentially pushed people away. People were tired of it. They didn't like it. They would leave and join bands of thieves like Robin Hood style, or they would go and meet with other escaped or runaway serfs and they'd start their own things. Or they would join with merchants who were neither serf nor lord and who made their money basically by moving products from one area where they were cheap to another area where they were expensive. And since the serfs had no means to provide for their own survival, these merchants began paying them to provide for their survival. The displaced serf became an employee, and thus the employer-employee relationship was born, which is one of the bases for the capitalist system. The other basis for capitalism is the word capital. Now, capital had long been defined before capitalism as money used to make more money. And this is what merchants and money lenders did at the time. Because the employer-employee relationship was based on capital, it became known as capitalism. And so capitalism came to be alongside feudalism. So what are the major differences between feudalism and capitalism? Why was this change so huge? Well, first, in feudalism, serfs were bound to the lord across generations through intense personal bonds and history, even through church rituals which sanctified the bonds between the serf and the lord. All of society was based on that. However, in capitalism, the relationship was voluntary. Each person in the exchange exchanged what was private to them. An employer and an employee, both willful participants. An employer giving up his money. An employee giving up their labor and time. So what's the problem? Everything seems fine. It's voluntary, right? Well, there's this thing called exploitation. Employers purchased labor power from employees and combined it with technology or tools or equipment to create a profit. The labor added value to a product that was worth more than the cost of labor itself. This left the employee with some left over, which is what we call profit. The reason this is exploitation is because the seller of labor power knows that they are being paid less than the value they are providing, or else there wouldn't be profit. Now, employers, by the very nature of capitalism, that is using money to make more money, want to pay their employees as little as possible. Now, that doesn't mean you never get raises. You might get a raise, but that's in the interest of the employer, knowing that you might go somewhere else if they don't give you one. Therefore, class struggle always follows capitalism, just as it had in feudalism. So then, how will we transition from capitalism to socialism? You have to remember that socialism is the exact same anger that led to capitalism. Class struggles, the sense of it being unfair, not being paid enough, that we're doing all the work and someone else is taking all the money and the rewards. Because of these class struggles, it's so important to recognize that the anger that makes people want to transition from capitalism to socialism is the exact same anger that led people to destroy feudalism and transition to capitalism. It is the next step. It is something better. It is an improvement on whatever is right now. And because of that, most employers understand that employees and their wages are the enemy. And we see from history that capitalism will only cede ground to socialism if it is in mortal danger. For example, in the late 1800s, when Otto von Bismarck of Germany saw the rise of socialism, what did he do? Well, he undertook a social state welfare program and began allowing labor unions. He was trying to appease the masses so everything didn't get burnt down. In America, FDR faced socialism's rise too. Think of Eugene Debs, my boy. FDR faced socialism's rise and the Great Depression, and we got the New Deal and unions and Social Security and unemployment insurance and a minimum wage and, oh yeah, women's right to vote. But both of these people, Otto and FDR, maintained capitalism, essentially saving it from socialism by giving up ground to socialists. And in the meantime, socialism itself was never accepted. Socialists everywhere were jailed, silenced, and crushed, like Eugene Debs, And of course, when the USSR came to be, and later the People's Republic of China, there was obvious, huge international opposition to that. The United States after World War II and Germany after 1968 did everything they can to purge socialism from government, academia, social life, everything. To this day, the US leads the charge against socialism. Just Google Cuba or Venezuela. Donald Trump hates these places. But there was a time in world history where socialism, or some kind of early form of it, was ascendant. Between 1917, when the USSR started, to 1989, when it imploded, socialism spread around the globe. The USSR thought that they would end the irrationalities of capitalism kinda easily through society's ownership of production and planned distribution of resources. All of that would work together and everyone would be happier and have everything they need. And in the meantime, they would be preventing the business cycle booms and busts that had destroyed so many lives throughout capitalism's history. To them, freedom from exploitation meant that over time they would work fewer hours, that as things got more efficient, as technologies got invented, that the surpluses created by those things, instead of going to some billionaire at the top, would just replace the amount of time they needed to work. So fewer hours. Turns out that didn't all work out, and there are still a lot of fears that capitalists had then that they still have now. For instance, only one employer means you can't quit work and go work for someone else. And that state apparatus would have too much power, especially if there was only one singular party, like in China right now. And socialism was likely to become dictatorial and extinguish civil liberties and individual rights, which it definitely did in a lot of places. After the 1989 implosion of the USSR, socialism had to be re-examined from the ground up. And things changed. The debate amongst socialists for a long time up until 1989 was whether we should do like the communists did and socialize the means of production, or if we should do like the democratic socialists did and have a democratic government that regulates and taxes industry. But neither of those ideas really work. You still end up with the same employer-employee dynamics, you still end up with exploitation, and you definitely end up with corruption in both of those models. The new idea, however, is contrary to both of the previous models of socialism, and it has to do with transforming workplaces themselves from capitalist hierarchies into flatter, fully democratic cooperatives. In this model, the role of the state is no longer the central issue, and people are free to build socialist structures without having power in the government. Macroeconomic transitions include transitioning some industries from private to publicly owned. Think about utilities, think healthcare, maybe airlines. And this would be a mix of economic planning and a regulated market economy. At the microeconomic level, we are transitioning the businesses themselves to democratic worker co-ops. Now, the reason to me that you have to socialize some industries and you can't rely entirely on microeconomic transitions is because people are never going to be able to pool enough money together to buy a gas company or anything like that. There's just no way that people can pool money to buy a hotel and the land it sits on. Any of these industries, the electric company, any of these utilities that we rely on, hospitals, there's no way regular people can buy them out, and therefore it requires the government to socialize them to get rid of the profit motives that definitely kill people. On the microeconomic level, I would add that you'd also have to push for strong racial and gender equality, and it'd have to be an intersectional microeconomic transition. You can't have democracy in a workplace if the workplace is mostly white and they vote against the black people, like, right? You still have all the problems. You don't have employee dynamics, but you still have negative dynamics that can exist, and therefore any kind of microeconomic transition has to be paired with a social justice initiative as well. At some point, feudal relationships between lords and serfs became not about the things they fought about, not the specifics, but about the relationship itself. And so the serfs conceptualized new ways of living and organizing society. Eventually, feudal relationships between serfs and lords became not about the things they were arguing about, but about the relationship itself. And so the serfs conceptualized new ways of organizing society, new ways of making money and supporting their families, and although it required a massive growth in consciousness and a massive amount of self-confidence and a long time, eventually they won. And eventually feudalism was destroyed and capitalism took over, and it was punctuated by the American and French revolutions, which we look back at pretty fondly. This is the same transition Wolff expects for socialism. Historically, socialism gains when capitalism fails. Think about the ebbs and flows, the recessions and the depressions, especially the 1930s. As socialist movements gained power, the employees relented and made concessions to keep the capitalist system in place. This includes the politicians who were backed by the capitalists and still are today. Right now, the formation of co-ops is growing fast, and capitalism has shown a whole lot of failures between coronavirus and Black Lives Matter and everything else going on in the world right now. Capitalism is weak, and although socialism isn't ascendant in any actual power, it is ascendant amongst people on the ground. And we should be optimistic about socialism for several reasons. First is we have finally a whole bunch of history lessons from Russia and China about what works and what doesn't. We also now completely know what to expect whenever we try to get any socialist agendas passed, which is huge political purges of socialists and jailings and probably killing us and demeaning us. Look at the Black Lives Matter protests and what the media and the politicians did to them until eventually, hopefully continuing, their narrative wins out. Fascism came after socialists before World War II, and anti-communism, Red Scare bullshit came after us after. So we're never going to be safe. We're never going to be the accepted political thought until we are. So that was Chapter 3 of Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video and please subscribe to this channel so I can keep making videos like this. If you have any questions, Adam has a comment below and I will definitely answer them to the best of my ability. Thanks again, and we will see you next time on Run It Back.